I'm nervous. This is a formidable crowd. Lots of editors in this crowd. We'll have comments. Just this week, Tom Fox wrote something in the NCR, and he quoted me, and I used the phrase "requiescat in pace," spelled E-N instead of I-N, and I had to call him the next morning to have it changed so that the Latin was correct, because the greatest editor of all, especially if Latin is right here before us. I met Tom Cornell in November of 1981. Campus ministry at Notre Dame was starting a draft counseling center in response to the reinstitution of the draft in 1980. And we wanted to get students to write up CO statements in case they would eventually be drafted, so we needed to be trained. We needed a workshop. People said, "Get Tom Cornell." So we did. Two of us picked Tom up at the airport. We went to dinner, talked about our plans for the next day. Tom jotted down a few notes, and then the conversation got more freewheeling, perhaps with the help of some red wine that was mentioned in the homily. And that's when I got nervous. Tom started talking about back in the day. He was intense, opinionated, and if his stories were true, which I believe they were, radical. And he used an edgy vocabulary that came easily to him. Words like revolution, resistance, anarchism, Trotskyist, and the MOB, short for the National Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam. When I mentioned that our office was in touch with NISBCO, the National Interreligious Service Board for Conscientious Objectors, run by the AFSC, Tom immediately harumphed, then sneered, "Oh, you mean the American Fiends Service Committee?" And then he recounted some offense that friends had committed back in the day. And then he gave what I've come to call the stare. It was at that moment that I got nervous. And I knew I had to say something. We had a rather moderate, tame group of faculty and staff at Notre Dame, and we had a very moderate and tame idea of a program for supporting COs, and I was nervous that Tom would scare them off and torpedo the whole project. So at the end of dinner, I said something like, "You can tone it down." And he just nodded and said, "All right." I was nervous dropping him off at Michael and Margaret Garvey's that night. I was nervous picking him up the next morning. I was nervous driving him to campus, nervous putting out the coffee and juice and rolls. And after introducing him, I stood in the back with my arms folded, scanning the room, nervous about what was about to happen. The outlandish things I was nervous that he would say. The presentation was brilliant. He spoke brilliantly, eloquently. His points were clear, concise, knowledgeable, appropriately serious, yet also reassuring. He quoted the Gospels, popes, Gandhi, King, Dorothy Day. He expounded on the traditional Catholic teaching on war and peace and explained the Church's recent rapid evolution at Vatican II, Gaudium et Spes, on matters of conscientious objection and nonviolence. Most of all, he assured us that the work of counseling young people on the moral implications of participating in war was central to a life in Christ and the mission of the church. By the end of the day, our group was ready and willing. Our program was launched. And in the years ahead, we counseled dozens of students who placed their CO statements on file should one day they need them. And we represented 3 ROTC students and the legal proceedings that got them discharged from the military. That was the beginning of the relationship Tom and I 40 years ago. 41. Looking back, I should not have been surprised at his stellar presentation that day. Had I known more of the particulars about his role in the peace movement. All these things that have been written in the past 10 days in the press, they're all true. He played a pivotal role in the peace movement in the 1960s and 70s and 80s and later. He was, Robert Ellsberg put it in America, an architect. Yes, we read. In 1963, he organized the first public demonstration against the Vietnam War. In 1964, he attended the famous Merton Retreat at Gethsemane on the spiritual roots of protest. A few weeks later, on New Year's Day in 1965, he and Jim Forrest, Jimmy, as Tom always called him, launched the Catholic Peace Fellowship. Also that year, 1965, in October, Tom burned his draft card while proud. Dorothy Day and A.J. Musty looked up. Tom was a liaison between A.J. Musty, the FOR, and Dorothy Day, the Catholic worker. And he was eventually convicted and sentenced to 6 months in prison. And right over there last night is a photo of him getting arrested. Weeks later, in the throes of the Roger Laporte tragedy, Tom wrote up statements to the press, struggling along with Jim to keep the CPF together, which they did. And so the work of the Catholic Peace Fellowship went on for years. Talks, conferences, the CPF bulletin, and counseling, giving help to 50 young men a week at one point, helping people discern their consciences. They weren't draft writers. Helping people to discern their consciences. Because in Catholic tradition, conscience is an interior witness to God within it. A voice by which we are to conduct our lives. In times of war, discerning whether or not to participate in a particular war, and if so, whether or not to participate in a particular operation within this war. These are all matters of conscience. And Tom was always ready to discuss these principles with people, young people especially. His pacifist vision, he would venture into the just war tradition because he saw that it was a way to resist modern war, not to undermine it. Whatever was on the heart and the mind of the person in front of him. During these years, Tom capsulized in a quotation the work of the Catholic Peace Fellowship. He said, "We don't counsel conscientious objection, non-cooperation, resistance, interference with selective service, or anything else. We counsel young men." He was a personalist. The person before you. He refused to allow important matters to be reduced to slogans and cliches. The work of God can't be summed up in a ready-made formula. It comes out in the give and take of discernment. There was a lot of excitement in those years. The church, at least a significant wing of the church, was becoming a sign of peace. Just like the sign of peace that we shared minutes ago. And beyond the Catholic Church, Tom had a broad ecumenical spirit, always ready to work with other Christians in the FOR. He worked from 1965 to 1979. He had a hand in starting Pax Christi in these years. In the early 80s, he served as a formal consultant to the Catholic bishops in the United States as they drafted their pastoral letter on War and Peace, the Challenge of Peace. One of the two representatives of pacifism and nonviolence to do so, the other being Gordon Zahn. But of course, the bishops brought in others to testify too, the big picture, big shot policymaker types. Casper Weinberger, big shot theologians like Paul Ramsey, and unfortunately they listened more to them. We're allowed to ask, given the state of the world today, what would have been like had our dear shepherds and successors to the apostles have listened to the little shots, like Tom and Gordon, who grasped the real big picture, a cosmos governed by justice, tempered by mercy, enveloped by love, the ways of which are revealed in Christ's teaching and example on peace. Well, these days, these pacifist, great days are speaking about Father. They weren't all his life. Tom told me that, there's mundane moments too, right? The day-to-day. Tom told me one time he went to the Catholic order to do great things, heroic things, and they gave him a potato peeler and put him on the carrots. And he wondered, when do the heroic acts begin? The next year, he met Monica Rugard over a pot of soup, Monica says. They courted and got married the year after that. Soon came Tommy and Deirdre. Perhaps a bona fide Catholic worker family. Perhaps the greatest achievement. Not his own, though. It was a marital achievement. If Tom today were asked what he identifies as, he would probably say, he might say, patriarch. He wasn't afraid of that word. But with every patriarch comes a matriarch as well. I think we need to ask the matriarch to stand and to give her a round of applause. Please go. This is an act of non-cooperation. So we all students. Monica married your brother. I would call Tom in the middle of the afternoon. And we'd talk for 20 minutes. And I'd say, give my love to Monica. And he'd say, she's very nervous. Lying down. I have to say, I can't but think that these early years of this great marriage were hard years. Pilgrim years for sure, an itinerary that led from the Lower East Side to Crown Heights in Brooklyn to Newburgh with a beautiful view. New Hampshire, Waterbury, those years. My father spoke so well about years of struggle. We get hints of this in Dorothy's diaries of family and financial straits. A lay mendicant experience. Lay poverty. This then is pure joy. In Dorothy's diary entry in August of 1979, she says, Tom and Monica visited. He wants to leave the FOR and return to the Catholic worker, but we pay no salaries. They would like to be a family in residence at a new farm near Newburgh. He was a loyal friend when I was going through a grueling time in Kenmore Street. He and Monica are beautiful people, 2 kids. And a year later, in the column, Tom Cornell visited this afternoon. It's January 1980. He met his wife, Monica, at the Catholic worker. They had 2 lovely children. Still true. Well, they eventually did start a house in Waterbury and a soup kitchen, and Tom was ordained deacon. First for Hartford, then for New York. He counseled peace activism, talks, writings. In 1990, 5 of us, including Tom, responded to the call of 2 Mennonites in Germany who were struggling to handle scores of conscientious objectors whose claims were being put forth as soldiers stationed there. Tom's voice in that crazy time was a rudder. Solid. And not long after that, Tom and Monica did make their way back to the New York Catholic worker and settled on the farm in 1993, where they've been ever since. My memories of Tom are often associated with the farm, where I would come to see him. Tom managing the farm, keeping things moving, Deirdre and Kenny nearby. He would always update me on the grandchildren. Guests always going and coming. And Tom would give full reports over the phone, or I would come down to visit. Fresh vegetables, thank you. And Tom made the perfect omelet every morning, the perfect omelet. It was an art. A late afternoon glass of wine. But he never really did, as it said in one report last week, retire at the farm. He was teaching for the Archdiocese. He was preaching as a deacon right here. Going to other places to give talks. He'd come to Notre Dame every year or so and regale students with wisdom and wit and stories. And in August 2003, in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq, I got an email from Tom that said simply, Christmas in Baghdad could happen. And so it did. We went. He was 69 years old. We spent 3 weeks, and then, on the way back, we visited the Vatican, his insistence, to report on what we had seen, to the Dicastery of Justice and Peace. Loyal son of the church. was a dutiful mentor to us in the Catholic Peace Fellowship when we refounded it. And Jim and Bill and Tom were so generous in supporting it. He would read the sign of peace. But most of all, encouraged us in the counseling of soldiers. So we were glad for Tom to come out to a CPF conference in 2007 and to give him our own little modest St. Marcellus Award. And still, those years, he was attending Friday night meetings, editorial meetings of the paper, and then when he didn't travel, people would come to see him. He would always fill me in on the phone who was coming, which group was staying and helping him garden, the farming. He loved talking to young people. Sean Storr said of Tom just the other day, "I've never met a more encouraging Christian." I think I felt that back in 1981 when I first met him at that workshop. When I was 27, Ben Peters was finishing a manuscript on Gordon's On. I sent to Tom a few weeks ago. One of his last messages from me through Monica was, "I'm not going to be able to get to that manuscript." It was like 2 weeks ago. It'll have to wait. Faithful to the end. He used to sign off his letters with "resist" or "coraggio." Where did he get this confidence? This ceaseless strength? Well, this is the story he told. He started coming down to the worker in 1953. He said he was looking for something. You know, he had kind of a hard time. Deirdre and I were talking about this the other day. He was a worker. He was working class. He had hard jobs. And a tough, somewhat broken background in the family. Irish and Italians, and not good mix, and early deaths are the types of things which set a young person searching for something. And you don't know what you're searching for until you find it. He was 90 years old when he first met Dorothy Day. First, by reading The Long Loneliness, which he said spoke to my condition. And then, in person at a Friday night meeting, April 1953, he took a train downtown, found his way to 225 Christie Street, went upstairs to the meeting, and listened to the speaker, and someone pointed across the room saying, "There's Dorothy Day." The gray hair, knitting, clanging needles. When she didn't like what the speaker was saying, they quieted down when she liked what the speaker was saying. And at one point in the discussion, which was about security and nuclear weapons in the middle of the Cold War, someone was defending the idea that we should defend ourselves for the sake of our security. Because we have a right to security. At which point Dorothy stood up and spoke and said, "Security, security. I don't want to hear any more about security. There are young people here today. They don't need to hear about security. How will they do great things if all they're concerned about is their own security? Think not of the morrow. Look at the birds in the air. Consider the lilies of the field. Don't worry about what you are to eat, what you are to put on. If the grain of wheat does not fall into the ground and die, it remains alone. But if it falls into the ground and dies, it bears a great harvest. At that point, Tom recalled, she had me. I knew I'd never get away. Now, I remember that Friday night meeting, and I wasn't even born yet. That's the power of stories. The reality-creating power of stories. Tom later said of Dorothy, quote, "She opened the world to me. The really most important currents, a mystical current. This was the most important thing in the universe, and she put me in contact with it. I was able to participate in it. What more can you ask? How grateful you are. That's why you cry." Tom, what a life. How grateful we are. That's why we cry. Grateful for God's help through the hard times. Grateful for you, Tom, making it easier for us to be good. Grateful for the laughter of so many conversations. Grateful for the glory days of the past. And grateful even more for the glory days ahead. In Paradisum educante angelo. May the angels lead you into paradise. May the martyrs greet you at your arrival and lead you into the holy city of Jerusalem. May the choir of angels greet you, and like Lazarus, who was once poor, may you have eternal rest.